In this lecture, we will discuss the integumentary system, and part 1 we will focus on the epidermis. Integumentary system consists of hair, skin, nails, and glands associated with the skin. So skin and all associated organs make up the integumentary system. Here we see a cross section of the skin and different organs that are associated with its function. When we take the skin and tissue associated with it, skin can be divided into two main layers. It's the epidermis and the dermis. Epidermis is a thin outer layer that's formed of stratified squamous epithelium, a type of epithelium that we studied in the previous lecture. Dermis is a much thicker inner layer underneath the epidermis. It is formed of connective tissue, blood vessels, smooth muscles, and even nervous tissue. There is a basement membrane that separates the epidermis from the dermis, and that helps anchor these layers together. In different cross sections of the skin, we will be able to see this basement membrane that helps them connect these two layers. Underneath the dermis, we also have a subcutaneous layer known as the hypodermis. This is the layer that's underneath the dermis, and this contains areolar and adipose tissue. So that helps bind the skin tissue, the dermis and the epidermis, epidermis and the dermis, to the underlying tissue, but this is not part of the skin. So two layers of the skin, and you find the hypodermis underneath that. So that is what we see here in the cross section of the skin. This outermost layer that we see right here is the epidermis. All the way goes to this basement membrane that we see here that separates the epidermis from the structures underneath it, which is the dermis. And underneath the dermis, we see this fat cell layer, adipose or areolar tissue, that will form the subcutaneous or the hypodermis. And we will look at some of these structures in details throughout this lecture. Again, looking at the epidermis, this is the skin that as we see it on the outside. Looking at a cross section, the uppermost layer will be called the epidermis, and it is separated from the dermis underneath it by this basement membrane. Underneath the epidermis, we will find the dermis structure, a structure of connective tissue. As we talked about, there will be hair follicles, blood vessels, some smooth muscles, just a connective tissue that brings all the nutrients, all the nerve signals that are needed, even for the maintenance of the epidermis. And if we remove the topmost layer of the skin, we will be able to see the dermis underneath it. And even below that, below the dermis, we will have the subcutaneous layer, also known as the hypodermis, which is a structure containing fat cells. All right, so let's focus on the epidermis, and we'll talk about different layers we find even in the epidermis. Most of the epidermis is made out of stratified squamous epithelial cells. These are epithelial cells. Squamous means they are flat cells. Stratified means there are multiple layers of these flat cells. So stratified squamous epithelial cells, and it is important for this layer to be a thick layer of epithelial cells so that it can form a protective barrier around our body. So this mostly consists of 4 layers, and in some areas where we will have thick skin, there will be a 5th layer as well. A stratum basal. Stratum basal is the deepest layer, and this is the one that has dividing cells. So stratum basal will be the deepest, the underneath layer that will have dividing cells that will then help maintain the epidermal cells, epidermal layer. As the basal cells divide, the older cells are called keratinocytes due to the accumulation of different fibrous proteins, keratins, and these move towards the top of the skin. So keratinocytes is the one that will uh, be a certain type of a pigmented type of cells that will have certain proteins and give strength, give certain kind of characteristic to the skin cells. So let's go through the four layers of the epidermis. The innermost layer, as we talked about, is the stratum basal. It's the innermost layer, and that's the layer that has dividing cells. The layer right above it is stratum spongiosum, followed by stratum granulosum, and then the topmost layer, the outermost layer, will be stratum corneum. They are dead cells, they are flattened cells, and they have keratinized cells, meaning cells full of these keratin and other fibrous proteins. In areas where we find thick skin, there will be a fifth layer called the stratum lucidum, and this is mainly in the palms and soles where we find thick skin. Epidermis is important because it has a protective function against water loss, mechanical injury, from chemical injury, and even keeping away microorganisms. This is our first layer of defense in our body. And if you just look at the different layers, we have here, all the way up to here, we talked about how there is a basement membrane that separates the epidermis from the dermis. So the topmost layer is going to be the stratum corneum, the topmost layer. This contains a lot of keratinized cells, mainly dead cells, and we'll discuss why that is. And then the second layer is the stratum lucidum, followed by the stratum granulosum, followed by the stratum spongiosum, and the final layer, stratum basal. So why these cells tend to die as they go up? We only have blood supply in the dermis region. So there is no blood vessels that go in the epidermis. Oxygen and nutrient exchange happens through diffusion. So the cells closest to the dermis gets most of the oxygen and nutrients, and they can divide, they can be functional. But as we go higher and higher, less oxygen, less nutrients get there. So these cells tend to die and form more of a barrier function. And again, this is the epidermis that we see, and the different layers will be part of the epidermis. And looking at thin skin and thick skin, we will have a thick skin mainly in the palms and soles of our feet, whereas thin skin will surround everywhere in our body, maybe apart from the lips and maybe eyelids. Looking at thick skin will have 5 layers: the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal. That's the thick skin. Thin skin will again have both the epidermis and dermis, and the epidermis will contain of the 4 layers without the stratum lucidum. So stratum corneum, granulosum, spinosum, and basal. Now let's talk a little bit about a specialized cell that we find in the epidermis that produces skin color. Melanocytes. Melanocytes are the cells in the human skin that produce skin color, or a compound known as melanin, and that will give skin color. So these melanocytes are present in the epidermis and even in hair follicles. Their basic feature is the ability to produce the compound, the protein called melanin. So as we see here, we have the nucleus of the cell. Even in these, within the cytoplasm, these melanosomes will contain melanin, and they will be sent away from the cell. So if we imagine this cell to be kind of in the bottom region, these melanosomes containing melanin can be produced and even given to cells around it. So this is again a, a view of a melanocyte, and all these dark spots are going to be areas where they collect the melanin that's produced. So if these cells are present towards the base, the stratum basal, or the basement membrane underneath it, we see they will be producing these melanin, and they will be sent, distributed to cells around them. And when these cells even continue to go higher towards the outer surface, they will contain this melanin that will give the skin pigmentation or skin color. So all people have about the same number of melanocytes, uh, irrespective of the skin color. However, skin color is genetically determined, and they involved in the amount of melanin that the melanocytes produce. Even though everyone has the same number of melanocytes, the amount of melanin produced by these melanocytes will be genetically determined. So skin color results of a combination of genetics, environment, and physiological factors. So more exposure to sunlight, these melanocytes even might tend to produce a little bit more melanin. And these genetic differences play a main role as well. And as we talked about, how sunlight, UV light, X-rays can cause darkening of the skin. Circulation within the dermis and blood vessels also can have certain effects to skin color. So the more blood that accumulates in the dermal region, you might get a little bit more red skin, like flushing type of skin. And you even might tend to get something called yellowish skin from something known as jaundice due to certain liver disease. So when certain compounds like bilirubin is accumulated close to the skin, it might even give a yellowish type of skin. We'll continue this lecture in part 2.